Welcome to Dear Fans. David sat at the corner booth of a quiet diner, the air thick with the scent of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee. It was a place he used to come to relax back when things felt simpler before everything changed. The walls were a dull shade of yellow lined with old photographs of the town's history, and the low hum of casual conversation buzzed around him, yet all David could hear was the sound of his own thoughts, heavy and disjointed. His eyes scanned the menu in front of him, but the words were a blur. He tried to focus, blinking hard, but they swam together, making it impossible to distinguish one from the other. His fingers trembled slightly, a side effect of the traumatic brain injury he'd sustained during his time in the army. It wasn't just the injury itself that had altered him, but the aftermath, the confusion, the exhaustion, and the overwhelming sense that his mind wasn't quite his own anymore. He hadn't come here for sympathy. He wasn't one to ask for help. He had always prided himself on his strength, physical and mental, but lately things had been harder. Even a simple task like choosing a meal felt like a mountain to climb. He just wanted something familiar, something he could easily choose, without feeling this constant battle inside his mind. David rubbed the back of his neck, trying to center himself. A deep breath in, out, but it didn't help. The words on the menu just kept swimming, mocking him in their indecipherable jumble. He glanced around, trying to find something else to focus on. The faded red booths, the waitress who was busy cleaning a nearby table, the sound of the bell above the door jingling as a customer walked in. It was then that Laura, the server, approached. She was young, probably no older than 22, with an air of impatience about her. Her eyes darted over to him, noting that he was still staring at the menu. "Are you drunk?" she asked sharply, her tone cutting through the low chatter of the diner. David froze. The question caught him off guard. The edges of his vision darkened for a moment as the sting of her words hit him. No, he wasn't drunk, but how could she possibly know what he was dealing with? His hands tightened around the menu as he met her eyes. "No," he said, forcing the words out, trying to steady his voice. "I don't drink, ma'am. I suffered a traumatic brain injury. I'm an army veteran." Laura didn't seem to register the weight of his words. Instead, she glanced at him for a second, her eyes flicking to his hands before she sighed in annoyance. "Okay, well, do you know what you want?" she asked, her voice dripping with impatience. David felt a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. He had been staring at the menu for so long, trying to make sense of it, that the question felt like an accusation. He wasn't sure how to respond, so he just muttered, "It's taking me a while to understand what the words are on the menu." Laura didn't seem interested in hearing him. She just stood there, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "You've been wasting my time," she said flatly, the words harsh and dismissive. "You need to walk away." David's stomach twisted. He could feel the frustration bubbling up inside of him, but he didn't know how to voice it. It wasn't about the meal anymore. It was about his dignity, about being treated like a person instead of an inconvenience. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind struggling to keep up with the situation. "I'm trying, please," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Laura didn't seem to care. "You're wasting my time. Walk away now," she said again, her voice even colder than before. David's heart began to race. The familiar feeling of being dismissed, of being invisible, washed over him. He wanted to argue, to explain that this was harder than it seemed, but his words felt tangled in his throat. The last thing he wanted was to escalate things, but the tension in the air was thick. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his composure. Just then the door to the diner swung open and Caitlin Clark entered. She was casually dressed, a hoodie and sweatpants, but her presence was immediately felt. The room seemed to shift as she walked in, her confidence radiating in a way that made heads turn. She had a way of walking into a room that made everything else fade into the background. SAHOO. Her eyes flicked to the scene at the counter as she made her way toward it. She saw David still holding the menu and Laura, who was standing over him with a clear look of impatience. Caitlin didn't have to hear the exchange to understand the tension between them. Without missing a beat, Caitlin stepped forward and placed herself between David and Laura. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm and calm. Laura looked up, clearly surprised by Caitlin's sudden presence. "Why, what's your problem?" she asked, a defensive edge to her tone. "I don't care who you think you are," Caitlin replied, her voice unwavering. "You're being unprofessional. This man deserves respect, not to be treated like that." David's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected anyone, let alone someone as high profile as Caitlin Clark, to intervene. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. The feeling of being unseen, of being small and insignificant began to lift slightly. Laura hesitated, but Caitlin wasn't finished. "Let your manager handle it," she added, her voice cool and collected. The air was thick with tension, and for a long moment no one spoke. David sat back, feeling a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Caitlin stood between him and the server, like a shield, and for the first time all day, he felt like someone was on his side. "Certainly, let's continue," with a powerful and emotional tone as Caitlin stands up. For the veteran, emphasizing the respect and honor veterans deserve. The diner was still, the silence almost deafening as Caitlin stood firm between David and Laura. The weight of the moment was heavy, a realization sinking into everyone in the room. This wasn't just about a meal, this was about more than David struggling to make sense of a menu. This was about dignity, respect, and the unwavering truth that veterans deserved far better than this. Caitlin's eyes never left Laura, her gaze steady like a warrior on the court. "You think it's just about serving a plate of food?" Caitlin's voice cut through the tension, each word sharp, deliberate. "You think it's just a menu? Let me tell you something. This man," she gestured toward David, her voice now ringing with the power of 1,000 moments of sacrifice, "has given more than you could ever imagine, more than you could ever understand. He put his life on the line for this country. His service is the reason you can stand here and talk to him like that." Laura's face paled slightly. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but Caitlin didn't let her. "You may not see it, you may not know what it takes to walk in his shoes, but you owe him your respect. Every veteran does. Do you think it's easy? Do you think anyone who's been through what he's been through is here for your attitude or your disrespect?" David stood there, overwhelmed by the words. His hands, still slightly shaking, rested on the table. His throat tightened as Caitlin's words reverberated in his mind, echoing like a mantra of what he had endured and what so many others like him had gone through. "They come back home with scars, physical and emotional." Caitlin continued, her tone rising with every word, each one a battle cry for those who had fought and struggled in silence. "They don't ask for your pity, they don't ask for your sympathy, but they damn sure deserve your respect, and the least you can do is someone in the service industry is treat them with kindness, with dignity, every single day." There was no hesitation in Caitlin's voice, no softness, just raw, unfiltered truth. She wasn't just speaking for David anymore. She was speaking for every veteran who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or disrespected. The power of her words was undeniable. The entire diner had fallen silent, the weight of her message settling in their bones. David's heart swelled. The emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface began to break free, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like an invisible soldier. He wasn't just a man with a history of trauma, he was a person who deserved to be treated with humanity. Caitlin stepped closer to the counter, her gaze unflinching. "I'm not asking you to be perfect, but I'm demanding that you treat every veteran who walks through these doors like the hero they are, because if you can't do that, then you shouldn't be serving anyone." Her voice was final, unyielding, and in that moment Laura knew there was no room for argument. Laura stood there, her face flushed with the weight of the words. She said nothing. Nothing could be said. Caitlin turned to David, her expression softening just slightly. "You deserve better than this," she said quietly, as if it was a promise. "Don't ever forget that." David swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had never expected anyone to speak up for him, let alone someone like Caitlin Clark, someone whose name was known across the world. But in that moment, Caitlin's words felt like the truth he had been waiting to hear for years. He had felt like his sacrifices were invisible, his struggles ignored. But now, here in the midst of this small diner, someone had stood up and reminded him that he mattered. The silence in the diner lingered for a moment longer, the weight of Caitlin's message hanging heavy in the air. Then slowly David stood up from the table. His legs were unsteady, but he didn't feel quite so broken anymore. His voice when he spoke was quiet but clear. "Thank you," he said, his words carrying a depth of emotion that only those who had walked through similar struggles could understand. Caitlin nodded, giving him a small smile. Anytime she turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind a lingering sense of resolve. David watched her go, his heart a little lighter, his sense of self a little stronger. In that diner, in that moment, he had not just been seen, he had been respected. And as for Laura, she didn't say a word. She couldn't. Caitlin's words had shattered the facade of indifference, leaving her to reckon with the truth she had tried to ignore. As Caitlin exited the diner, the air seemed to shift. The once noisy hum of clinking silverware, the chatter of customers, and the clatter of kitchen staff all fell into an unnatural stillness. It was as though the very walls of the diner had absorbed her words and refused to let them go. David sat there still stunned by what had just happened. He felt a mix of gratitude and disbelief. His mind was trying to process it all. Caitlin Clark, the star, the one people cheered for from the stands, had stood up for him, for a veteran, for someone who had spent far too many days in silence, far too many years feeling like a shadow of who he once was. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not as a soldier who had come back broken, not as the person who had been ignored or dismissed, but as a human being who deserved respect, who deserved to take his time, who deserved to be treated like anyone else. David slowly took a deep breath. The trembling in his hands had lessened. He looked down at the menu once more. The words were still jumbled, still hard to make sense of, but the pressure that had been building in his chest seemed to ease. He didn't have to rush. He didn't have to feel ashamed the way his mind worked anymore. He could take the time he needed. No one was going to make him feel less than for it. It was then that the manager, a middle-aged man named Tom, appeared at the counter. He had been in the back when Caitlin had spoken up, but now he was fully aware of what had transpired. He walked over to David, his face showing a mix of embarrassment and resolve. "I want to apologize for what happened earlier," Tom said, his voice quiet but sincere. "That was uncalled for. We should have never allowed that to go on." David met Tom's eyes, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He was just tired of being misunderstood, tired of being forced to explain something that felt so beyond the comprehension of those who hadn't been through it. But Tom's apology, sincere though it was, seemed to break through the wall David had built around his emotions. "It's all right," David said, his voice hoarse. I don't need anyone to feel sorry for me. I just need to be treated like everyone else." Tom nodded, visibly moved by David's words. "You're right, you deserve that." David looked around the diner, and for the first time today it felt different. The customers at the other tables were no longer glancing over, no longer whispering or making assumptions. It was as if Caitlin's words had rippled through the room, reminding everyone of the respect every person, especially those who had served, deserved. David nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile forming on his face. "Thank you, I'll be fine." Meanwhile, outside the diner, Caitlin was walking to her car, her mind already moving on to the next thing. But as she reached the driver's door, she paused, her hand on the handle. She thought about what she had just done, about the words she had spoken, about the weight of them. It wasn't just about standing up for one person, it was about standing up for every veteran, every person who had been ignored or overlooked. Caitlin Clark knew deep down that the fight wasn't always on the court. It wasn't just about the game, it was about making sure that those who had fought for the country, those who had sacrificed so much, didn't have to fight alone. When they came home, her eyes softened for a moment as she looked back at the diner. "You're welcome," she whispered, even though no one could hear her, as she pulled out of the parking lot and into the street. David sat back in his booth, his fingers grazing the edge of the menu. He still hadn't made his choice, but that didn't matter right now. What mattered was the feeling of dignity he hadn't realized he had been missing. What mattered was the unexpected reminder that sometimes someone's voice, someone's willingness to stand up, could change everything. The days following that moment in the diner felt like a blur to David. He had walked out of the restaurant that day with a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The world seemed less overwhelming, less daunting. The constant noise in his head, the fear of being ignored, the frustration that accompanied every social interaction, it all seemed to quiet for just a while. It wasn't a complete fix, but it was a start. He hadn't expected. David's friends, those who knew him well, noticed a change in him too. He wasn't as withdrawn. He wasn't hiding behind the veil of isolation he'd so often cloaked himself in. Every time they met, he spoke more freely, his smile a little less forced, his eyes a little brighter. They didn't know what had happened, only that something had shifted within him. What they didn't know was that it wasn't just Caitlin Clark's words that had made the difference. It was the feeling of being seen, of being understood. For so long, he had felt like a ghost in his own life. But in that diner, in front of strangers, Caitlin had reminded him that his sacrifice mattered, his struggle mattered, and that in itself was a kind of healing. Meanwhile, Caitlin was still thinking about that moment as well. The diner seemed like a distant memory, but in truth it had impacted her deeply. She hadn't just stood up for David that day, she had stood up for every person who had ever been told to remain silent, every person who had felt small or invisible. It wasn't something she could shake off. She couldn't forget the look in David's eyes as her words cut through the tension. It had been more than just a random act of kindness, it had been a reckoning. Caitlin had spent years on the court, under the spotlight, always striving for greatness. But the impact of what happened in that diner reminded her that real greatness came not from the victories or the accolades, but from using your platform to lift others. She had the power to make a difference not just with her athleticism, but with her voice, her presence. And that's exactly what she had done. She had reminded people of what respect truly meant, what kindness and empathy could do for someone's soul. David, for the first time, began to speak out about his experiences, not out of anger, but out of necessity. He began sharing his struggles not as a veteran seeking pity, but as a man reclaiming his dignity. The more he spoke, the more he realized that the words Caitlin had spoken to him in the diner were the catalyst for something bigger. For the first time in years, he no longer felt like he had to apologize for who he was or what he had been through. One afternoon months later, David found himself on a stage at a local event honoring veterans. It wasn't a huge crowd, but it was enough to make him nervous. He stood there dressed in a simple suit, his hands folded neatly in front of him, but as the microphone was handed to him, something inside him clicked. His voice was steady as he spoke, his words strong, filled with the rawness of everything he had experienced. He didn't just talk about his time in the military, he talked about the pain of coming back home, of feeling like he didn't belong, of feeling erased. And then David said, his voice clear and unshaken, "I had an encounter that changed everything, a simple act of kindness from someone I didn't even know, someone who didn't just see a soldier who'd come home broken. She saw a man, she saw me, and that was the moment I realized I'm not invisible, and I never will be again." The crowd sat in stunned silence as David's words hung in the air. Some people wiped tears from their eyes, others looked around trying to make sense of what they had just heard. It wasn't just a story, it was the story of every veteran who had been ignored, of every person who had felt they didn't belong, and now in this moment they all understood. Later that night, as David walked off the stage, he received a message. His phone buzzed softly, and when he looked, he saw it was from Caitlin. "Clark, just saw you on stage. You were amazing. You gave them something they didn't know they needed, your truth." Babe Avid smiled softly, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: he had found his voice again, and he would never let it be taken away. And Caitlin, wherever she was, would never know just how much that moment had meant. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the ripple effect she had created. The lives she had touched, the respect she had instilled in others. Her act of standing up for David wasn't just a fleeting moment, it had changed the course of his life, and in turn the lives of so many others who had felt forgotten. Like this video and subscribe this channel. Thank you.